Texas sun beat down on Fort Hood, baking the parade grounds to a dusty crisp. It was March of 1958, and a new batch of recruits was filing in a mix of nervous energy and forced bravado. Among them, one figure stood out, not for his height or his build, but for the quiet buzz that seemed to follow him. He was a young man with dark, slicked-back hair, a thoughtful expression, and eyes that held a hint of shyness, yet also a deep well of calm. His name was Elvis Presley, and he was, without a doubt, the most famous person to ever step foot on that military base as a simple private. Elvis had always made it clear. He wanted no special treatment. He wasn't here to be a celebrity. He was here to serve his country just like any other man. Still, the whispers followed him like his shadow. That's him, isn't it? The king of rock and roll. In the flesh. Soldiers, fresh from basic training or already serving, craned their necks to catch a glimpse as he moved through the processing line. He wore the standard fatigues, no different from anyone else, and carried his duffel bag with a quiet determination. He checked in, got his bunk assignment, and walked into Barracks 37. It was a long, open room, lined with metal bunk beds, foot lockers, and the smell of worn boots and cheap soap. A few soldiers were already there, polishing boots or writing letters home. The hum of conversation died down as he entered. For a moment, the only sound was the clatter of his own gear as he dropped his duffel bag beside an empty lower bunk. Elvis didn't look up immediately. A few nervous chuckles broke the silence. One burly soldier polishing a rifle gave a nod. "Welcome to the real world, Presley," he grunted, a hint of challenge in his tone. That burly soldier was Private Joe Smitty Smith. Smitty was big, with a perpetual scowl and a chip on his shoulder. He'd been in the Army for a year, and he liked things a certain way. Tough, no nonsense, and without any frills. The idea of a pampered rock star joining their ranks rubbed him the wrong way. He saw it as a joke, a publicity stunt, something that cheapened the grit and sacrifice of true soldiers. Smitty had been waiting for this moment, eager to see if the king was as soft as he imagined. Smitty walked over, his boots thudding loudly on the linoleum floor. He stood over Elvis, who was carefully folding a t-shirt. "So, the king himself," Smitty drawled, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Heard you got a special bunk, private bathroom, maybe even a red carpet for your little highness." Elvis paused, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look up at Smitty immediately. He finished folding the shirt, placed it neatly in his foot locker, and then slowly straightened up his eyes. The color of warm honey met Smitty's. There was no anger in them, no fear, just a steady, calm gaze. "No, sir," Elvis said, his voice quiet but clear. "Just a bunk like everyone else. And I reckon I'll be using the same latrine, too." He offered a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Just here to do my duty, Private Smith. No special treatment needed or wanted." Smitty narrowed his eyes clearly, expecting more of a reaction. He wanted to see the superstar squirm, wanted to provoke a flashy outburst, but Elvis's calm, almost dismissive tone was disarming. It wasn't defiance. It was just a simple statement of fact, delivered with a quiet dignity that was hard to argue with. "We'll see about that, Presley," Smitty muttered, his voice still laced with suspicion. "This ain't no concert hall. You pull your weight, or you'll regret it." He puffed out his chest, trying to loom over Elvis, but Elvis simply held his gaze unblinking. Another soldier, a younger man named Billy Ray, who had been watching with wide eyes, suddenly chimed in. "Hey, Smitty, lay off. He just got here." Smitty shot Billy Ray a glare, and Billy Ray quickly shrunk back. Smitty turned his attention back to Elvis, who had already gone back to unpacking his meager belongings. He was neatly arranging his uniform, his movements precise and efficient, as if Smitty wasn't even there. It was a subtle, non-confrontational way of showing he wouldn't be provoked. He wasn't rising to the bait. Smitty huffed, frustrated by Elvis's quiet resolve. He wanted a fight, wanted a spectacle. But Elvis was giving him nothing but polite indifference. It was almost more annoying than an argument. Smitty turned and stomped back to his bunk, muttering under his breath about prima donnas and Hollywood phonies. Elvis, meanwhile, continued to unpack. He felt the weight of Smitty's scrutiny and the curious glances of the other men. He knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't naive. Being Elvis Presley meant always being under a microscope, always having to prove himself. But he also knew that actions spoke louder than words, especially in a place like the army. He'd come here to be a soldier, not a star. And he intended to do just that, one quiet, determined step at a time. The real test, he knew, would come not in the spotlight, but in the grueling everyday routine of Army life. And he was ready for it. The first few days at Fort Hood were a blur of regulations, inspections, and endless drills. Elvis, along with his new platoon, quickly fell into the rhythm of military life. Reveille, at dawn, physical training until breakfast, then a full day of instruction, one rifle, disassembly, marching drills, obstacle courses, and lectures on military protocol. It was a stark contrast to his old life of late-night concerts and screaming fans. But Elvis embraced it with a surprising eagerness. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he was disciplined. He listened intently to every instruction, followed every order without question, and put in the effort. Polished his boots until they gleamed, made his bunk with crisp corners, and kept his uniform spotless. He was just another private trying his best. But for Private Smitty Smith, Elvis's quiet competence was an irritant. Smitty had been expecting a pampered celebrity who would complain constantly, fumble through drills, and ultimately crack under the pressure. Instead, Elvis was just doing his job. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid, and that bothered Smitty more than an outright failure would have. One morning, during rifle cleaning, Smitty decided to escalate his harassment. The platoon was gathered in the barracks, meticulously cleaning their M1S, the metallic smell of gun oil hanging heavy in the air. Elvis was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration as he ran a patch through the barrel of his rifle. Smitty, from his bunk across the aisle, suddenly called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Presley, you sure you know what you're doing with that thing? Thought you only knew how to strum a guitar and wiggle your hips." A few nervous snickers rippled through the barracks. Most of the other soldiers pretended to be busy, but their ears were clearly open. This was a direct challenge. Elvis didn't immediately respond. He finished, threading the patch, then carefully set his cleaning rod down, picked up the rifle and visually inspected the barrel, turning it slowly in his hands. Only then did he look up, his gaze calm and steady as he met Smitty's eyes. "Yes, Private Smith," Elvis said, his voice even and low. "I'm sure," our drill sergeant said, "to keep the bore clean and free of residue. That's what I'm doing." He paused, then added, "You done with yours, Smitty? Wouldn't want the sergeant to find any grime in there on inspection?" It wasn't an insult, or even a direct comeback. It was a simple, factual statement, almost a helpful reminder, delivered with an unshakable composure. It subtly turned the question back on Smitty, suggesting that perhaps Smitty should be focusing on his own duties rather than on Elvis's. Smitty's face flushed. He had been expecting a defensive retort, a stammer, anything that he could use to further undermine Elvis. Instead, Elvis had just acknowledged the instruction and politely deflected the challenge by reminding Smitty. It was a move Smitty hadn't anticipated. "Don't you worry about my rifle, Presley," Smitty snapped, trying to regain the upper hand. "Just focus on yours. Wouldn't want you to shoot your foot off trying to march and sing at the same time." Elvis simply gave a small, polite nod. "Yes, Private Smith, got it." He then went back to his rifle, calmly reassembling the parts, his fingers moving with practiced ease. He didn't offer another word, didn't show any sign of being rattled. He just continued his work, demonstrating his proficiency through action rather than argument. The moment hung in the air. The other soldiers exchanged glances. They saw that Elvis wasn't going to be drawn into a shouting match. He wasn't going to complain or act like he was above the work. He was just going to do it, and do it well. Smitty's taunts meant to expose a weakness, instead highlighted Elvis's quiet strength. Later that afternoon, during a particularly grueling marching drill under the scorching sun, Smitty tried another tactic. He deliberately bumped into Elvis in formation, throwing him slightly off step. "Watch it, Presley. You got 2 left feet or something?" he sneered. Elvis stumbled for a split second, then quickly regained his rhythm, falling back into perfect sync with the rest of the platoon. He didn't look at Smitty, didn't acknowledge the bump. He just kept his eyes forward, his expression fixed, marching onward. He didn't even break his stride. The drill sergeant, a stern but fair man named Sergeant Miller, had been watching them closely. He saw the deliberate bump, and he saw Elvis's non-reaction. After the drill, as the platoon was dismissed for a short break, Sergeant Miller pulled Elvis aside. "Presley," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "you're doing good work. Keeping up, no complaints." Paused, letting his gaze fall on Smitty, who was now swaggering away with a couple of his cronies. "Don't let anyone get to you. Just keep doing what you're doing. The Army's got a way of sorting things out." Elvis simply nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that." He knew that the sergeant's quiet words of encouragement meant a lot. He wasn't asking for special treatment, but it was good to know that his efforts were being seen. He wasn't just blending in. He was earning respect, one quiet, steady step at a time. Smitty's attempts to undermine him were, in a strange way, only making him stronger and more respected by those who mattered. Life in the Army quickly settled into a monotonous routine. A relentless cycle of physical training, drills, and chores. It was designed to break down individuals and rebuild them as a cohesive unit. For most, the grind was a shared struggle, a bond forged in sweat and exhaustion. For Elvis, it was a test, one he was determined to pass without a single false step. He woke up before reveille, polished his boots, made his bed with military precision, and was always among the first to be ready for formation. During PT, he pushed himself, even when his muscles screamed. He might not have been a natural athlete, but his determination was fierce. He'd learned resilience in the rough and tumble world of early rock and roll, navigating hostile crowds and skeptical critics. The Army, in many ways, was just another stage where he had to prove himself. Smitty, however, remained a persistent thorn in his side. He seemed to relish every opportunity to make Elvis's life harder. During mess hall duty, Smitty would accidentally spill water near Elvis's feet, or forget to hand him a crucial piece of equipment. During barracks cleanup, he'd find fault with Elvis's perfectly made bunk, despite it passing the sergeant's inspection. "You call that a tight corner, Presley?" Smitty would sneer, poking a finger at the fabric. "Looks like a dog slept in it. Maybe you need a maid to do it for you, King." Elvis would simply look at the corner, then back at Smitty, his expression unreadable. "Seems fine to me, Smitty," he'd say calmly. "Sergeant Miller passed it this morning, but if you see something I don't, feel free to point it out." Always willing to learn, he'd never argue, never raise his voice. He'd just meet Smitty's aggression with polite, almost bewildered curiosity. It was incredibly frustrating for Smitty, who thrived on confrontation. One afternoon, during a map-reading exercise, Smitty tried to sabotage Elvis's work. Task was to plot a course across a complex terrain map, working in pairs. Elvis was paired with a quiet, studious recruit named Taunts, who seemed intimidated by Smitty. Smitty, meanwhile, was paired with another bully, Private Henderson. As they worked, Smitty accidentally knocked a cup of coffee near Elvis's map. "Spoops, my bad, Presley," Smitty said, feigning surprise with a smirk. "Clumsy me. Hope you didn't need that part of the map," Thomas guessed, looking worried. Elvis, however, simply leaned back. He looked at the coffee stain, then at Smitty, his eyes holding a surprising flicker of amusement. "No worries, Smitty," Elvis said smoothly. "Just a little extra character for the map. Good thing I already had this section memorized. Always a good idea to know your terrain by heart, just in case of spills." He gave a small, pointed glance at Smitty, who stiffened. Elvis then calmly produced a small folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a perfectly drawn, hand-copied section of the map, specifically the area that had just been stained. He had made it himself as a backup. He simply laid it over the stained portion and continued working, unperturbed. Thomas looked at Elvis with admiration. Smitty, on the other hand, was fuming. His attempt to disrupt Elvis had backfired spectacularly, making him look foolish, and Elvis look even more prepared. Word of Elvis's quiet resilience began to spread beyond their immediate platoon. Other soldiers who might have initially been skeptical started to notice. They saw him not as the flashy superstar, but as a guy who just got on with the job, no matter what was thrown at him. They saw him offering a helping hand to others, quietly sharing his meager candy rations, or listening patiently to a homesick recruit's troubles. During one particularly tough obstacle course, a smaller, younger recruit got stuck trying to scale a high wall. He was clearly exhausted and about to give up. Smitty and his friends just laughed. But Elvis, who had already cleared the wall, didn't hesitate. He reached down a hand, offering a firm grip. "Here, buddy," he said, his voice gentle. "You got this. Just grab on." The recruit, grateful, took Elvis's hand and with a final surge of effort, pulled himself over. Elvis gave him a reassuring pat on the back. It was a small act, but it was seen, and it spoke volumes. The admiration for Elvis, even if unspoken, was palpable among the general ranks. Smitty, sensing this shift, grew even more frustrated. He couldn't understand it. He saw Elvis as a fake, someone who didn't deserve the respect he was slowly, quietly earning. Couldn't break Elvis's calm, couldn't make him react the way he wanted. And that made him angrier than ever. Tensions in Barracks 37 were like a slow-burning fuse, threatening to ignite at any moment. Smitty was determined to expose Elvis, to prove that his quiet dignity was just an act. And Elvis, with his unwavering composure, was ready for whatever came next. The platoon was on the firing range, a vast expanse of dust and distant targets. The air hummed with the crack of rifles and the shouted commands of the instructors. It was a high-pressure environment demanding focus and precision. This was where a soldier's true mettle was often revealed. Elvis, surprisingly, was a good shot. He listened intently to the instructions, adjusted his stance, and squeezed the trigger with a steady hand. He wasn't breaking records, but he was consistently hitting the bullseye, impressing even the veteran instructors. This quiet competence infuriated Smitty even more. He himself was struggling, his shots often wide of the mark, and watching Elvis perform well only deepened his resentment. During a break, as soldiers reloaded magazines and wiped sweat from their brows, Smitty decided to make his move. He approached Elvis, who was calmly cleaning his rifle, checking the bore for carbon residue. "Look at Mr. Sharpshooter here," Smitty sneered loud enough for several nearby soldiers to hear. "Think you're hot stuff, Presley? Just 'cause you can hit a stationary target? What about when the going gets tough, huh? What about when someone's actually shooting back?" Elvis, Smitty's aggressive glare, with his usual calm. "I hope I never have to find out, Smitty," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I hope none of us do. That's why we train right to be ready no matter what." Smitty scoffed. "Oh, listen to the wise man. You think this is a game. Presley, this is serious. You're just play acting for the cameras, waiting for your discharge so you can go back to your fancy life." He stepped closer, invading Elvis's personal space. "You don't belong here, Presley. You're soft, a faker." The other soldiers nearby stopped what they were doing, sensing the rising tension. This was more than just typical barracks banter. Smitty was pushing hard, trying to provoke a strong reaction. Elvis held Smitty's gaze. His expression was still calm, but a flicker of something deeper. A quiet resolve entered his eyes. He slowly put his rifle down, carefully placing it on the bench. Then, without a word, he took a deep, steady breath. "Smitty," Elvis began, his voice still low but with an edge of quiet authority that surprised everyone. "I'm here because my country called, just like you. I'm here to do my part. I clean my rifle. I do my drills. I listen to my sergeants. I don't ask for special treatment. And I don't complain." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you think that's soft or faked, then I guess we see things differently. but I don't believe any man who steps up to serve his country is soft. And I definitely don't believe you're a faker, Smitty. You're out here too, doing the same hard work." Elvis wasn't fighting back with anger or insults. He was fighting back with dignity and an unexpected understanding. He wasn't just defending himself, he was acknowledging Smitty, recognizing his own presence and effort, even if it was through a lens of animosity. He was calling Smitty's bluff by refusing to take the bait and instead offering a kind of quiet solidarity. Smitty was momentarily stunned. He'd expected an argument, an outburst, a chance to escalate the conflict. Instead, Elvis had turned his insult into a shared experience, almost a compliment. It completely disarmed him. He sputtered, unable to come up with a quick retort. "Now," Elvis continued, his voice returning to its normal quiet tone, "if you're quite done, I'd like to finish cleaning my rifle. We got more shooting to do, and I aim to hit every target." He picked up his cleaning rod, a subtle indication that the conversation was over. Smitty stood there, his face red, his mouth slightly agape. He looked around at the other soldiers, who were now pointedly looking away, some with faint, knowing smiles. Smitty had tried to humiliate Elvis in front of everyone, and instead, Elvis had quietly, effortlessly turned the tables. Smitty was the one left, looking foolish and aggressive, while Elvis remained calm, collected, and surprisingly magnanimous. Sergeant Miller, who had been observing the exchange from a distance, walked over. He didn't say anything directly to Smitty, but he stopped right beside Elvis. "Presley," he said, his voice crisp, "good work today. Your grouping is improving. Keep it up." He gave Elvis a brief, approving nod, then walked off, leaving Smitty standing alone, defeated and simmering. The incident was a turning point. It wasn't just that Elvis hadn't reacted. It was how he hadn't reacted. He hadn't been a doormat, but he hadn't been aggressive either. He had simply held his ground with quiet strength, refusing to be drawn into the negativity. Public display of his character solidified his growing reputation. It was becoming clear to everyone, even the most skeptical, that Elvis Presley wasn't just a performer. He was a man of genuine character. Constant pressure of army life often brought out the best and sometimes the worst in people. Homesickness was a common affliction, especially among the younger recruits who were away from their families for the first time. Private Billy Ray, the timid soldier who had tried to defend Elvis on his first day, was one such recruit. He struggled with letter writing, often staring blankly at the paper, unable to put his feelings into words. One evening after lights out, when most of the barracks were asleep, Elvis noticed Billy Ray sitting quietly on his bunk, a crumpled letter in his hand, a tear tracing a path down his cheek in the faint light filtering from the windows. Elvis, who often found it hard to sleep after a long day, had been reading a worn paperback. He gently closed his book and quietly approached Billy Ray's bunk. "Everything all right, Billy Ray?" Elvis whispered, his voice soft. Billy Ray startled, quickly wiping his eyes. "Yeah, Private Presley, just writing a letter home to my mama." His voice was thick with emotion. "It's harder than I thought. Don't know what to say." Elvis nodded understandingly. "It can be tough, can't it? Being away from family." He paused, then added, "Sometimes just telling them what you did that day or how you're feeling is enough. They just want to know you're okay." Billy Ray looked at the crumpled paper, a sigh escaping him. "I miss her cooking, Private Presley, and her singing. She's got the prettiest voice." Elvis's eyes softened. He thought of his own Mama Gladys, and a wave of homesickness washed over him too. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "My mama's the same best cook in the world. And her voice, well, it always made me feel safe." He hesitated, then a small, comforting smile touched his lips. "Sometimes when I'm feeling low, I just hum one of her favorite hymns. It helps." Billy Ray looked up, surprised. "You do, Private Presley." "Elvis," he corrected gently. "And yeah, I do. It's a comfort. Reminds you where you come from." Then, almost instinctively, Elvis began to hum a soft, simple melody. It wasn't a rock and roll tune. It was a gentle old gospel hymn, one his mother used to sing. His voice, even in a whisper, was rich and warm, filling the quiet barracks with a peaceful sound. He hummed for a few moments, then stopped. Billy Ray looked at him, his eyes wide, no longer filled with tears, but with wonder. That's beautiful, Elvis," he whispered. "Thank you." Elvis just smiled. "Anytime, buddy. Now you get that letter written. Your mama's waiting." Quietly returned to his bunk, leaving Billy Ray with a renewed sense of peace and the melody echoing in his mind. Unbeknownst to them, Smitty, whose bunk was a few rows down, hadn't been asleep. He'd heard the hushed conversation, heard the quiet hymn. He'd expected Elvis to scoff at Billy Ray's homesickness or to ignore it completely. He hadn't expected the genuine kindness, the shared vulnerability, or the unexpected melody. It was a side of Elvis he hadn't seen, a warmth that clashed with the image of the fake celebrity he'd built in his mind. Smitty usually scoffed at displays of emotion, but something about the simple honesty of the moment made him just listen. Another instance of Elvis's quiet kindness came during a particularly tough field exercise. The platoon was out in the wilderness, learning survival skills. One recruit, Private Garcia, had sprained his ankle during a cross-country march and was struggling to keep up. Clearly in pain, he was trying to hide it, not wanting to seem weak. Smitty, who was ahead, just yelled back, "Come on, Garcia, what's the holdup? You gonna hold us all back?" But Elvis, walking behind Garcia, noticed the limp and the grimace on his face. Without a word, he adjusted his own heavy pack, then subtly reached out and took some of the gear from Garcia's pack, distributing it into his own. "Lighten your load, Garcia," Elvis said, his voice low so only Garcia could hear. "We all got to pull together out here, no sense hurting yourself." Worse. He didn't make a fuss, didn't draw attention. He just did it. Garcia looked at him, surprised and grateful. "Thanks, Presley," he mumbled, relief washing over his face as the weight eased. Elvis just nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. Continued to carry the extra weight, never complaining, just moving forward. These weren't grand gestures or public performances. They were quiet, unassuming acts of empathy and assistance, almost like secrets shared between Elvis and those he helped. But word, as it often did in the close-knit army community, spread. Soldiers talked. They noticed, they saw the contrast between Smitty's taunts and Elvis's genuine care. And slowly, steadily, a different kind of respect for Elvis began to take root in the hearts of the men around him. Even Smitty, observing these actions from the periphery, felt a faint, unsettling shift in his own rigid perceptions. The relentless pace of army life began to take its toll on everyone, including Smitty. He was a physically strong soldier, but he struggled with the academic aspects of training, the complex tactical maps, the detailed equipment, maintenance manuals, and the endless military regulation. He hated asking for help, seeing it as a sign of weakness, and his frustration often boiled over into anger. One afternoon, the platoon was given a challenging written exam on advanced first aid and battlefield procedures. It was complicated, requiring memorization of intricate steps and quick decision-making. Smitty, despite his bravado, was clearly out of his depth. He chewed on his pen, scowled at the paper, and muttered curses under his breath. He was failing, and he knew it. His pride was taking a brutal hit. Elvis, who had always been a diligent student, finished his exam with time to spare. He quietly reviewed his answers, then sat back waiting for the bell. He noticed Smitty's struggle. Could see the anger and humiliation building in Smitty's eyes. When the exams were collected, Smitty practically threw his paper onto the pile, a furious blush coloring his cheeks. He stomped out of the classroom, muttering about the stupid test and pointless book learning. He disappeared into the barracks, likely to brood alone. Later that evening, after dinner, most of the soldiers gathered in the recreation room to play cards or listen to the radio. Elvis, however, noticed Smitty wasn't there. He felt a quiet nudge of concern. He knew Smitty was a bully, but he also recognized the raw pain of failure in a man who prided himself on his strength. Elvis decided to check on him. He found Smitty sitting on his bunk in the quiet, mostly empty barracks, cleaning his rifle with aggressive, jerky movements. He wasn't cleaning. He was just trying to work off his frustration. The rifle parts clanked together loudly. "Hey, Smitty," Elvis said softly, approaching the bunk. He didn't sit down, just stood respectfully a few feet away. Smitty glared up, his eyes red-rimmed. "What do you want, Presley? Come to gloat? To tell me how smart you are?" "No, Smitty," Elvis replied, his voice calm and steady. "Just checking on you. Tough test today, huh?" Smitty scoffed. Tough. It was ridiculous. All that technical jargon. What good is knowing how to spell hemorrhage going to do me in a firefight? "A lot of good, actually," Elvis said gently. "Knowing the right steps can save a life, maybe even your own or a buddy's." He paused. "It ain't about the spelling, Smitty. It's about knowing what to do." The sequined Smitty slammed a rifle part down. "Easy for you to say, Mr. Brains. Not all of us are cut out for this schoolboy's stuff." His voice cracked slightly with frustration. "I'm good with my hands. I can build anything, fix anything. But put a bunch of words in front of me, it just turns to mush." Elvis nodded slowly. "I get that," he said. "Sometimes it helps to break it down, to visualize it. Like you're building something or fixing an engine. Each step leads to the next." He thought for a moment. "My daddy always said, if you can explain it to yourself in simple terms, you really know it." He didn't offer to tutor Smitty, not directly. He just offered a different way of looking at the problem. He talked about his own struggles with complex song arrangements, how he had to break them down into simple melodies and rhythms before putting them back together. He spoke about patience and persistence, not as abstract concepts, but as practical tools for learning. Smitty listened grudgingly at first, then with a flicker of something like interest in his eyes. Elvis wasn't lecturing him or making him feel stupid. He was just talking, sharing a different perspective, almost like a quiet conversation between equals, focusing on the problem, not the failure. "It ain't easy," Elvis concluded, "but it's important. And you're a good soldier, Smitty. You got the grit, just gotta find a way that works for you to get this stuff into your head." Smitty didn't reply. He picked up another rifle part, but his movements were less jerky, more thoughtful. He still looked frustrated, but a hint of his earlier anger had diffused. He hadn't asked for help, and Elvis hadn't offered it in a way that would wound his pride. Instead, Elvis had offered understanding, a quiet empathy that cut through Smitty's defensive shell. As Elvis quietly turned to leave, Smitty mumbled, "Thanks, Presley." It was barely audible, rough and unpracticed, but it was there. It wasn't an apology, but it was a recognition. A tiny crack in the wall Smitty had built around himself. Elvis simply nodded, a faint, knowing smile on his face, and walked away. He knew that true change, like respect, was often earned in the quiet, unseen moments. The Army, for all its rigid structure, sometimes forced unlikely connections. The shared hardships, the exhaustion, the moments of unexpected camaraderie. These things could break down barriers faster than anything else. Smitty, despite his attempts to maintain his hardened exterior, found himself slowly, almost imperceptibly changing his view of Elvis. It began subtly. Elvis, with his quiet nature, often seemed to be in the background, yet he missed nothing. He was observant. He knew who was struggling, who needed a boost, and who just needed a moment of peace. One sweltering afternoon, during a particularly grueling field exercise, the platoon was ordered to dig a series of foxholes in rocky, unforgiving terrain. The heat was stifling. The ground was hard as concrete and morale was plummeting. Smitty, usually the picture of brute force, was having a tough time. His shovel kept hitting rocks, and his hands were blistering. He cursed loudly, throwing his shovel down in frustration. "This is ridiculous," he fumed. "They want us to dig through solid rock with these toy shovels. Impossible." The drill sergeant standing nearby simply barked, "Get it done, Private Smith, or you'll be digging all night." Smitty picked up his shovel again, glaring at the ground as if it had personally offended him. He swung it with renewed anger, but it only bounced off another hidden rock. Elvis, who had been working steadily on his own foxhole a few feet away, heard the outburst. He had found a relatively clear spot for his own hole and was making decent progress. He paused, leaned his shovel against the dirt mound, and walked over to Smitty's struggling position. "Looks like you hit a vein of granite there, Smitty," Elvis said, his voice calm, devoid of judgment. He knelt down, picked up a loose rock, and examined it. "This kind of rock. It's like an old man's heart." Stubborn Smitty looked at him, surprised by the lack of sarcasm. "No kidding, Presley. I'm about ready to just lie down and let them bury me." "Nah, you won't do that," Elvis said with a small smile. "Not you, but you're working against it, not with it." He pointed with a gloved finger. "See these cracks? This is where you want to go. Find the seams, work around the big ones, break up the small ones. It's like digging a well. You don't fight the earth, you persuade it." He took Smitty's shovel. "Here, let me show you." He didn't dig a whole new hole for Smitty, but he showed him a technique. How to find the natural fault lines in the rock, how to use the tip of the shovel to pry rather than just hack, how to loosen the surrounding dirt to expose the larger rocks before trying to remove them. He worked for only a minute or two, expertly demonstrating the method. "Sometimes a different approach helps," Elvis said, handing the shovel back. "No shame in learning a new trick." Smitty took the shovel, his face still grim, but a spark of curiosity in his eyes. He tried Elvis's method, and to his surprise, it worked. He managed to pry loose a stubborn rock that had been blocking his progress. He looked up at Elvis, a grudging nod of thanks in his eyes. "All right, Presley, thanks." Elvis just gave a brief nod in return and went back to his own foxhole, leaving Smitty to process the unexpected assistance. It wasn't a grand gesture, no public display of help. It was just a quiet, practical tip, offered without judgment or expectation of reward. Later that week, during a rare evening of downtime, a small group of soldiers was gathered playing cards. The conversation drifted to home, to families and dreams. Smitty, usually aloof, was listening from his bunk. Someone mentioned music, and one of the recruits said, "Hey, Elvis, why don't you sing us something? Just a little tune from back home." Elvis hesitated. He rarely sang in the barracks, not wanting to draw attention to his celebrity, but he saw the genuine longing in their eyes, the need for a moment of comfort and connection. He glanced around, his eyes briefly meeting Smitty's. Smitty gave him an imperceptible nod, almost a challenge, as if daring him to be the king. For a moment, Elvis took a deep breath. "Parek," he said softly, "but just a little something. No fancy moves, just a simple tune my mama used to sing." He then began to sing an old gospel hymn, "Peace in the Valley." His voice, unplugged and raw, filled the barracks. It was rich, soulful, just pure, heartfelt emotion. The barracks went completely silent. Soldiers stopped their card games, their conversations, and just listened. Smitty, from his bunk, lay still, his eyes closed. He'd heard Elvis's hit songs on the radio, seen him on TV, but this was different. This was raw, vulnerable, and incredibly beautiful. It wasn't the king. It was just Elvis. A man with a voice that could reach into your soul and touch something deep inside. For the first time, Smitty felt a profound connection, a shared humanity with the man he had tried so hard to despise. The music was a bridge, silently connecting them, reminding Smitty that beneath the famous name was just a man like any other, with hopes, fears, and a deeply kind heart. The Fort Hood maneuvers were the ultimate test, a simulated combat exercise designed to push every soldier to their limits. It was a week-long ordeal in rugged terrain filled with mock battles, forced marches, and sleepless nights. The pressure was immense, and frayed nerves were common. During one particularly intense simulated ambush, a smoke grenade went off too close to Private Miller, a new recruit who was already jumpy. The sudden explosion in thick, acrid smoke caused him to panic. He froze, disoriented, clutching his head, unable to follow orders to move to cover. He was effectively a casualty. Commanding officer, a tough but experienced Captain Davies, was observing the exercise. He barked orders, but Miller wasn't responding. Smitty, who was supposed to be advancing with his fire team, was further ahead, focused on his own position. He glanced back, saw Miller struggling, and yelled, "Get moving, Miller, what's your problem?" but made no move to help. He had a job to do, but Elvis, who was nearby, saw Miller's fear. He didn't hesitate. While others paused, trying to figure out what to do, Elvis dropped his rifle, quickly assessed the situation, and moved. He sprinted through the swirling smoke, ignoring the simulated gunfire, and reached Miller. "Miller, hey, look at me," Elvis said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the chaos. He gently but firmly grabbed Miller by the shoulders, shaking him slightly. "You're okay. We gotta move now." Miller's eyes were wide with terror. He was hyperventilating. Elvis didn't waste time. He slung Miller's arm over his shoulder, practically carrying the dazed recruit, and dragged him towards the designated cover area, all while keeping a low profile and shouting directions for the rest of his fire team. He moved with a surprising blend of urgency and practiced calm, like a seasoned combat medic. He didn't stop until Miller was safely behind cover, then quickly checked on him before grabbing his own rifle and rejoining the fight. He hadn't asked for permission, hadn't waited for orders. He had simply seen a soldier in distress and acted instinctively, prioritizing the safety of his comrade over the immediate tactical objective. Captain Davies, who had witnessed the entire scene, was visibly impressed. He'd seen plenty of soldiers freeze or hesitate in similar situations. Elvis's quick, selfless action stood out. It wasn't about being a celebrity. It was about being a soldier, a leader, a man of character. Later that day, after the exercise concluded and everyone was exhausted but safe, Captain Davies called Elvis and Smitty over. "Presley," Captain Davies said, his voice firm but with a note of respect, "your actions today, assisting Private Miller, that was exemplary. You showed ignifery, you showed intifa, and truly wall. You saw Private Miller in distress. You did nothing but yell at him. Your duty is not just to yourself, but to your comrades. Teamwork is paramount in combat. What do you have to say for yourself?" Smitty swallowed hard. His face flushed. "Sir, I was focused on the objective, sir. We were under fire. My training, I just assumed he'd snap out of it." It was a weak excuse and he knew it. Captain Davies' gaze was unyielding. "Assumptions get men killed, Private. Your personal animosity towards Presley has been noted, but today he acted like a soldier, a real soldier, while you hesitated. Consider that a lesson. We protect our own. All of us." He was being publicly reprimanded, and Elvis, the man he had ridiculed, was being praised. The shame burned through him. It wasn't just the captain's words. It was the quiet truth of Elvis's actions that cut him to the core. Elvis hadn't been flashy, hadn't sought glory. He had simply acted with quiet conviction, saving a fellow soldier. Later that night, back in the barracks, the atmosphere was different. There was a palpable shift. Smitty, for the first time, felt truly humble. He saw the respect in the eyes of the other soldiers towards Elvis, a respect that was no longer based on his fame, but on his undeniable courage and compassion. He saw how Elvis had stepped up when he, Smitty, had failed. The rigid walls of his prejudice finally began to crumble. The Army had, indeed, as Sergeant Miller had once said, sorted things out. And in doing so, it had shown Smitty a side of himself and of Elvis that he had never expected. The week of maneuvers had been grueling, but it had also been broad. The shared experience, the close calls, and especially Elvis's actions had shifted the dynamic. In Barracks 37, quiet respect for Elvis was no longer just a murmur. It was an open acknowledgement. Smitty, however, remained withdrawn, grappling with his own conscience. The reprimand from Captain Davies, coupled with the undeniable truth of Elvis's heroism, weighed heavily on him. He felt the shame of his past behavior, the pettiness of his taunts, and the stark contrast with Elvis's selfless nature. For 2 days, Smitty avoided Elvis. He kept his head down, spoke to no one unless necessary, and dedicated himself to his duties with an almost desperate intensity. Cleaned his rifle meticulously, made his bunk with fierce precision as if trying to scrub away his own guilt through sheer effort. Elvis, meanwhile, went about his routine as usual. He didn't gloat, didn't seek out Smitty, didn't even seem to notice the shift. He simply continued to be himself, quiet, diligent, and kind to everyone. This lack of reaction from Elvis was ironically what finally pushed Smitty to act. Elvis wasn't demanding an apology. He was simply allowing Smitty the space to come to it on his own. One evening, after the last lights out with only the dim glow of the guard light illuminating the barracks, Smitty couldn't take it anymore. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the day's events replaying in his mind. He remembered every snide remark, every sneer, every attempt to belittle Elvis. And then he remembered Elvis's calm eyes, his quiet courage, his simple acts of kindness. He remembered Elvis helping Billy Ray with his letter, showing him how to dig and finally pulling Miller to safety. Taking a deep breath that hitched in his chest, Smitty slowly rose from his bunk. He moved quietly, his bare feet padding softly on the cold floor. He approached Elvis's bunk, which was just a few rows away. Elvis was awake, lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, probably thinking about home or music, or maybe just the day's events. "Presley?" "Smitty," whispered his voice, rough, barely audible in the quiet. Elvis turned his head slowly, his eyes open. Smitty?" he replied, his voice soft. Smitty swallowed hard. This was harder than any obstacle course. His heart hammered in his chest. I need to say something," he began, his voice wavering slightly. He took another breath. "I've been a real jerk, Presley, a real fool." He paused, searching for the right words. "All this time I thought you were some kind of fake, some rich kid playing soldier. I thought you were soft and I treated you like dirt." He looked down at his hands, clenching them into fists. "I was wrong about all of it." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Elvis's. There was no anger, no judgment in Elvis's gaze, only a quiet understanding. "What you did for Miller, and even before that. All the little things. You're a real soldier, Presley, a better man than me. And I'm sorry for everything." The apology was raw, heartfelt, and utterly sincere. The words, once so impossible to utter, now flowed with the weight of genuine remorse. Elvis listened patiently, letting Smitty speak his truth. When Smitty finished, the barracks was silent again. Save for the distant hum of machinery, Elvis finally spoke, his voice gentle and low, almost like a sigh. "Smitty," Elvis said, "I appreciate you saying that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." He paused, then continued. "We're all here, doing our best. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we judge folks too quick. It happens." He then offered a small, reassuring smile in the dim light. "I never held any of it against you, Smitty. Not truly. We're in this together, aren't we? That's what the Army teaches you, to look out for each other." It wasn't a formal handshake, just an open hand, a gesture of peace and acceptance. Smitty hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out and clasped Elvis's hand. It was a firm, honest grip. In that quiet moment, under the watchful silence of the sleeping barracks, years of animosity dissolved. The bullying was over, replaced by a mutual understanding and surprisingly a burgeoning respect. It was a quiet reconciliation, witnessed only by the shadows and the lingering scent of Army life. Smitty, for the first time in a long time, felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifted from his shoulders. And Elvis, with his quiet response, had once again, without fanfare, earned the deepest kind of respect. The remaining months of Elvis's service at Fort Hood passed quickly, marked by continued dedication and the quiet, strong friendships he forged. Smitty, true to his word, became a changed man. He no longer picked fights or found fault. Instead, He often sought Elvis out for advice, not just on Army procedures, but on life in general. He learned from Elvis's calm demeanor, his patience, and his genuine kindness. The other soldiers noticed the change in Smitty, and the atmosphere in Barracks 37 shifted from one of underlying tension to quiet camaraderie. Elvis continued to be just another soldier, pulling his weight, excelling in his duties, and always ready with a helping hand or a listening ear. He never leveraged his fame, never sought attention. He was just Elvis Presley, Private U.S. Army, and it was this unwavering authenticity that cemented his legacy among his fellow soldiers. Finally, the day arrived, March 5th, 1960. The day Elvis Presley, now Sergeant Elvis Presley, was to be honorably discharged. He had served his full 2 years, a testament to his commitment and determination. The barracks was buzzing with a bittersweet energy. While everyone was happy for Elvis, there was also a sense of loss. He had become a quiet pillar of their platoon, a steady presence who led by example. Elvis meticulously packed his footlocker one last time, his movements as precise as the day he arrived. Put on his dress uniform, the medals earned through his service gleaming on his chest. He looked at himself in the mirror, not as the king of rock and roll, but as a soldier, a man who had faced challenges and emerged stronger. As he finished, Smitty approached his bunk. He was dressed in his own fatigues, a serious expression on his face. He held something in his hand, a small, worn wooden carving of an eagle. It wasn't perfect, clearly handmade, but it was earnest. "Presley," Smitty said, his voice surprisingly soft, "I wanted to give you something. It ain't much, but I carved it myself to remember us by." He held out the eagle. "You taught me a lot more than any drill sergeant. You taught me what real strength is." Elvis took the carving gently, his fingers tracing the rough edges. His eyes, usually so composed, softened with emotion. "Smitty," he said, his voice a little husky, "this means a lot more than you know, thank you." He looked at the eagle, then back at Smitty, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "You're a good man, Smitty, a good soldier. Don't you forget that," Smitty nodded, a rare small smile touching his own lips. "You too, Elvis, you too." Word spread that Elvis was leaving. Other soldiers from the platoon and even some from other companies started gathering. Billy, Ray, Private Thomas, Private Garcia, and others came to say their goodbyes. There were handshakes, back pats, and quiet words of appreciation. No one asked for an autograph or a photo. They just wanted to shake his hand, to look him in the eye, and to offer their genuine respect. Sergeant Miller, their stern but fair drill sergeant, was also there. He walked up to Elvis, extending his hand. "Sergeant Presley," he said, his voice gruff but with unmistakable pride. "Been an honor to serve with you. You came in here a celebrity and you walked out a soldier. You set an example for every man here. Well done." Elvis shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Sergeant. I learned a lot from you. It was an honor." As Elvis walked out of Barracks 37 for the last time, his duffel bag over his shoulder, he didn't look back at the cameras waiting outside the base gates. He looked at the men, his comrades, who stood watching him go. He gave them a final quiet salute, and they returned it, a wave of hands rising in unison. He stepped out into the bright Texas sun, a private citizen, once more but forever changed. He had come into the Army a global superstar burdened by expectations and prejudice. He had faced a bully who sought to diminish him, but with quiet dignity, unwavering character, and simple acts of kindness, he had not only withstood the challenge, but had transformed it. He had shown that true respect wasn't given because of fame or power, but earned through humility, integrity, and the strength of one's own quiet beating heart. And in doing so, he left Fort Hood, not just as a legend, but as a deeply respected man, leaving an indelible mark on the lives of the soldiers he had served alongside.